A black man in an expensive suit walks through a hospital corridor late at night. The security guard approaches him and says, "Visiting hours are over. You need to leave." The man calmly replies, "I'm not a patient." But the guard doesn't listen until other doctors arrive and address him as Dr. Washington.
Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and a comment before we start to learn more about what happened.
The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Medical Center cast harsh shadows across the polished linoleum floors. It was nearly midnight on a Tuesday, and the hospital corridors carried that familiar mixture of disinfectant and lingering anxiety that hospitals never quite shake. Most visitors had gone home hours ago, leaving only the essential staff, a few overnight patients, and the quiet hum of life-saving machines. Dr. Marcus Washington pushed through the main entrance doors, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the floor with measured steps. He was a tall, distinguished black man in his early 40s, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His silver watch caught the light as he checked the time. 11:47 p.m., earlier than expected. Marcus had just finished a grueling 12-hour surgery conference in Boston, where he'd presented groundbreaking techniques in cardiac surgery to some of the country's most respected surgeons. As the head of cardiac surgery at St. Mary's, he was used to these late-night returns, usually slipping quietly into his office to review case files before the morning rounds. The hospital was his second home, a place where he'd spent nearly 2 decades building his reputation as one of the region's most skilled surgeons. He moved through the lobby with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged there, nodding briefly to the night security guard at the front desk. The guard, a middle-aged woman named Rosa, had seen him countless times over the years and simply waved without looking up from her crossword puzzle. Marcus headed toward the elevator bank that would take him to the cardiac wing on the 7th floor. His mind was already shifting to tomorrow's schedule: 3 surgeries, 2 consultations, and a department meeting. As he walked, his phone buzzed with a text from his surgical resident about a post-operative patient showing excellent recovery signs. A small smile crossed his face. These moments, knowing that lives were being saved and improved, made every late night and missed dinner worth it. But as he rounded the corner toward the elevators, his peaceful evening was about to take an unexpected turn. "Hey! Hey, you!" The voice was sharp, authoritative, and clearly directed at him. Marcus paused and turned around to see a security guard approaching with purposeful strides. The guard was a white man in his 30s, stocky and broad-shouldered, wearing the standard hospital security uniform. His nameplate read Brad Hoffman, and there was something in his posture that immediately set Marcus on edge. It wasn't the walk of someone asking a polite question. It was the walk of someone who had already made up his mind about what he was seeing. "Yes," Marcus replied calmly, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone used to being respected. Hoffman stopped about 6 feet away, his hand resting casually on his radio. His eyes scanned Marcus from head to toe, taking in the expensive suit, the briefcase, the confident posture. But instead of seeing a professional, Hoffman seemed to see something else entirely. "Visiting hours ended at 9, Hoffman said bluntly. "You need to leave." Marcus blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me. Visiting hours are over. Time to go." Hoffman's tone was growing more aggressive, and he took a step closer. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Marcus said, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the growing irritation in his chest. "I'm not a visitor. I work here." Hoffman let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Yeah, right. Look, buddy, I don't know what game you're playing, but I've been working security here for 8 years. I know who works here and who doesn't. And you don't belong here." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. In all his years at St. Mary's, through medical school, residency, fellowship, and his rise to department head, He had never been treated this way by hospital staff. Sure, he'd encountered subtle racism in academic medicine, the kind that came wrapped in polite smiles and backhanded compliments. But this was different. This was raw, unfiltered prejudice standing directly in his path. "I'm Dr. Marcus Washington," he said, his voice still controlled but carrying an edge of steel. "I'm the head of cardiac surgery. I've worked at this hospital for 18 years. Hoffman's expression shifted to one of mocking disbelief. "Oh, so now you're a doctor. And not just any doctor, but the head of cardiac surgery?" He shook his head with exaggerated disappointment. "Man, if you're going to lie, at least make it believable. The head of cardiac surgery. Come on." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't just about visiting hours or a case of mistaken identity. This was about something much deeper, something that had followed him his entire career, despite every degree on his wall, every life he'd saved, every paper he'd published in prestigious medical journals. "I can show you my hospital ID," Marcus offered, reaching slowly toward his inside jacket pocket. "Don't move," Hoffman barked, his hand moving to his radio. "I don't want to see anything from you except your back as you walk out that door." Marcus froze, his hand halfway to his pocket. Around them, the late-night hospital continued its quiet rhythm. A nurse wheeled a cart down a distant hallway. Somewhere, a monitor beeped steadily. Life and death decisions were being made in operating rooms and ICU units throughout the building. And here he stood, a surgeon who had performed over 3,000 successful operations, being treated like a criminal in his own workplace. "This is ridiculous," Marcus said, his professional composure beginning to crack. "I have surgery in the morning. I have patients counting on me. Just look at my ID, call my department, check the directory." "The only thing I'm going to check is how fast you can walk to the parking lot," Hoffman replied. "Now move." Marcus had faced discrimination before, but never so blatantly, never so aggressively. Part of him wanted to push back harder, to demand that Hoffman call his supervisor, to make this ignorant man understand exactly who he was dealing with. But another part of him, the part that had learned to navigate the subtle racism of academic medicine, told him to stay calm, to de-escalate, to find another way. "Look," Marcus said, his voice carefully measured, "I understand you're doing your job, but I'm telling you the truth. I'm a doctor here. I'm not a visitor. I'm not a threat. I'm just trying to get to my office." Hoffman stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could smell the coffee on his breath. "I've heard every sob story, every lie, every excuse in the book. You think you can waltz in here in your fancy suit and fool me? I wasn't born yesterday, pal. Now you can either walk out of here with your dignity intact, or I can call the police and have you escorted out. Your choice." The threat of police involvement sent a chill through Marcus. He was a black man in America, and he knew how quickly these situations could escalate beyond all reason. He thought about his wife, Patricia, sleeping peacefully at home. He thought about his teenage son, Kevin, who looked up to him as a role model. He thought about his patients who would be counting on him tomorrow morning. But he also thought about every young black medical student who had ever looked to him as proof that they could make it in this field. He thought about every time he'd been the only black surgeon in a room full of colleagues. He thought about the responsibility that came with breaking barriers. "I'm not leaving," Marcus said quietly, but with unmistakable resolve. "This is my workplace. These are my patients, and I have every right to be here." Hoffman's face reddened. "We'll see about that." He grabbed his radio and brought it to his mouth. "This is Hoffman in the main lobby. I need backup for a trespasser who's refusing to cooperate." The radio crackled to life. "Copy that, Brad." "What's the situation?" "Got a guy claiming to be a doctor, refusing to leave after visiting hours. thinks he can intimidate his way past security. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the situation. In just a few minutes, this would escalate beyond anything he could easily control. Other security guards would arrive, possibly police. Hospital administrators would get involved. There would be reports, investigations, potentially media attention. All because a security guard couldn't believe that a black man in a nice suit might actually be the head surgeon. But just as Hoffman was finishing his radio call, the elevator doors down the hall opened with a soft ding. Out stepped Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the hospital's emergency physicians, followed by Dr. James Morrison, a senior anesthesiologist. Both were colleagues Marcus had worked with for years, people who knew him not just as a fellow physician but as a friend. Dr. Chen spotted Marcus immediately and her face lit up. "Marcus, I thought that was you. How was Boston?" She walked over with a warm smile, completely oblivious to the tension in the air. "Dr. Washington," Dr. Morrison added, joining them. "Perfect timing. I wanted to ask you about the Patterson case, the one scheduled for tomorrow morning." The change in Hoffman's expression was immediate and dramatic. His face went from aggressive certainty to confusion, then to something approaching horror as the implications began to sink in. He looked back and forth between Marcus and the two doctors, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I, Hoffman stammered, his radio still in his hand. Dr. Chen finally noticed the security guard and the tension radiating from Marcus. Her smile faded as she took in the scene. "Is everything okay here?" Marcus looked at Hoffman, then at his colleagues. He had a choice to make. He could let this slide, pretend it was all a misunderstanding, avoid the uncomfortable conversation that was about to happen. Or he could address what had just occurred, not just for himself, but for every other person of color who might face similar treatment. "Officer Hoffman here was just doing his job," Marcus said carefully, his eyes never leaving the security guard's face. "He was making sure that only authorized personnel were in the hospital after visiting hours." The words were diplomatic, but the underlying message was clear. Both Dr. Chen and Dr. Morrison were experienced enough to read between the lines. They looked at Hoffman with new understanding, and their expressions hardened. "I see," Dr. Morrison said coldly. "And Officer Hoffman, did you ask Dr. Washington for his hospital identification?" Hoffman's face had gone completely pale now. I thought." "You thought what, exactly?" Dr. Chen's voice was sharp now, all pretense of politeness gone. "You thought that our head of cardiac surgery, one of the most respected physicians in this hospital, was some kind of intruder?" "I didn't know he was—" Hoffman began, then trailed off, realizing that any explanation he offered would only make things worse. Marcus watched the security guard's discomfort with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This was what racism looked like when it was forced into the light of day. Not the subtle systemic barriers that were easier to ignore, but the raw, ugly prejudice that reduced an accomplished surgeon to a suspicious character based solely on the color of his skin. "Didn't know he was what?" Marcus asked quietly. "A doctor. The head of a major department. Someone who's been saving lives in this hospital since you were probably still in high school." The radio in Hoffman's hand crackled again. "Brad, do you still need that backup?" Hoffman stared at the radio like it was a snake. Around them, more hospital staff were beginning to take notice. A nurse walking by slowed her pace, sensing the tension. An orderly pushing a wheelchair glanced over with obvious curiosity. "Tell them you don't need backup," Marcus said, his voice calm but commanding. "Tell them it was a misunderstanding." Hoffman raised the radio to his mouth with a shaking hand. Cancel that backup request. False alarm." "Copy that." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Chen and Dr. Morrison flanked Marcus like protective guards, their loyalty and respect for their colleague obvious. Hoffman stood alone, the weight of his mistake crushing down on him like a physical force. "Officer Hoffman," Marcus said, stepping forward slightly, "I want you to understand something. I don't wear my hospital ID on my lapel when I'm in the building because everyone knows who I am. I've been working here longer than you've been employed as security. I've performed emergency surgeries that have saved lives while you were at home sleeping. I've trained dozens of residents who are now saving lives around the country. And tonight I was simply trying to get to my office to prepare for tomorrow's surgeries." Hoffman nodded mutely, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. "Now," Marcus continued, "I could file a complaint about this incident. I could demand to speak with your supervisor, with hospital administration, with anyone who will listen. And frankly, part of me thinks I should because if you've treated me this way, how many other people of color have you harassed? How many patients, visitors, or staff members have you intimidated based on nothing more than their appearance?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Hoffman's breathing was becoming more labored, and sweat had begun to form on his forehead despite the air-conditioned hospital corridor. "But," Marcus said, his voice softening slightly, "I'm going to give you a choice. You can continue working here, continue doing your job, but you need to understand that your job is to protect patients and staff, not to make judgments about who belongs here based on your personal biases. Can you do that?" Hoffman nodded quickly, desperately. "Yes, sir. Absolutely. I'm so sorry, Dr. Washington. I made a mistake. A big mistake." "Yes, you did," Marcus agreed. "But mistakes can be learning opportunities if we're willing to grow from them." Dr. Chen placed a supportive hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Marcus, you're being more generous than I would be." "Maybe," Marcus replied, "but I've learned that anger, while justified, doesn't always lead to the change we need to see." He turned back to Hoffman one final time. "I'll be watching, Officer Hoffman. Not just me, but all of us. This hospital serves one of the most diverse communities in the state. Our patients, our visitors, our staff, they come from every background imaginable. If you can't treat all of them with the respect they deserve, then this isn't the right job for you. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, sir. Completely. Thank you for... thank you for giving me another chance." Marcus nodded once, then turned toward the elevators. Dr. Chen and Dr. Morrison fell into step beside him, the three of them walking together in solidarity. Behind them, Hoffman remained standing in the lobby, processing what had just happened and, hopefully, what needed to change. As they waited for the elevator, Dr. Morrison broke the silence. "Marcus, I'm so sorry that happened to you." "It shouldn't have happened to anyone," Marcus replied. "But it did, and now we move forward." "Will you report it?" Dr. Chen asked. Marcus considered the question as the elevator arrived. "I'll document it, yes. Not necessarily to get Hoffman fired, but to make sure there's a record. If this kind of thing happens again, there needs to be accountability." They stepped into the elevator together, and as the doors closed, Marcus caught a glimpse of Hoffman still standing in the lobby, staring at the floor. The security guard looked like a man who had just discovered something very uncomfortable about himself. The elevator rose quietly toward the 7th floor. Marcus looked at his reflection in the polished metal doors and saw not just a surgeon, not just a department head, but a black man who had just navigated another reminder that his accomplishments would never fully shield him from prejudice. But he also saw someone who had chosen grace over anger, education over retaliation. His phone buzzed with another update from his surgical resident. Tomorrow's patient was stable and ready for surgery. Life continued, as it always did, moving forward despite the obstacles and the ignorance. When the elevator doors opened on the seventh floor, Marcus stepped out into the cardiac wing that he had helped build into one of the most respected departments in the region. His office was at the end of the hall, past the nurses' station where his name was displayed prominently on the department directory, past the wall where his medical degree, fellowship certificates, and numerous awards hung in testament to nearly 2 decades of dedicated service. But tonight, none of those external validations mattered as much as something else. The knowledge that he had faced ignorance with dignity, prejudice with professionalism, and hatred with hope for change. As he settled into his office chair and began reviewing tomorrow's surgical cases, Marcus Washington knew that the real victory wasn't in proving who he was to a security guard who should have already known. The real victory was in maintaining his humanity while doing it. Outside his office window, the city slept peacefully, unaware that one of its finest surgeons had just fought a quiet battle for respect and won, not through force or anger, but through the steady, unshakable knowledge of his own worth. The next morning would bring new challenges, new lives to save, new barriers to break. But tonight, Dr. Marcus Washington prepared for those challenges with the same dedication and excellence that had always defined him, knowing that every patient he helped, every life he saved, was a testament not just to his skill as a surgeon, but to his strength as a human being. And somewhere in the hospital below, a security guard named Brad Hoffman went home that night with a lot to think about, carrying the weight of his own prejudices and, hopefully, the first seeds of change.